Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sheriff Andrews House 200th anniversary celebration. It's a wonderful day for it, and thank you so much for coming here. Before we get started, I was just delivered to me today something very important. It is a certificate of acknowledgement that comes from the Houses of Parliament, and it says that as follows: Sheriff Andrews House, built in 1820, this bicentennial anniversary is a reminder of the historic and architectural value of this important provincial historic site. Built by Elisha Andrews, High Sheriff of Charlotte County and a loyalist from Connecticut, the building reflects the early economic prosperity of the town of St. Andrews and the province of New Brunswick. Congratulations on the occasion of its 200th anniversary. Signed, John Williamson, MP, New Brunswick Southwest. I guess I'm your master of ceremonies for this part of the process, and what I first want to do is this leads into me acknowledging the province of New Brunswick for the preservation of this wonderful building and the long-term maintenance program that it undergoes. And beyond that, I also want to express appreciation to the province, and particularly to the Heritage Branch of the Tourism and Culture Department, for the management agreement that we've had now in place for several years, so that the town of St. Andrews can actually operate the house on a day-to-day basis during the season when it's most visited by tourists. And this has been, I think, a wonderful arrangement, and I hope it goes on for many more years. I also really want to express the gratitude that I have really is for the past and present staff of this house and the wonderful experiences that they've given to people over the years who've chosen to come here. And I really think that makes the difference. We have had excellent staff here, and I know I'll speak about that in just a minute in terms of my own experience. But before we get further into the program, which I know you're all waiting to see what the people on the fringes here have to say to you in a little bit of time. But I do want to say one thing that doesn't exactly fit here today on the 200th anniversary, but I think it's a very important thing for someone like myself to say. Out of respect, I want to acknowledge that First Nations people have also walked this land for nearly 13,000 years. So having said that, I want to talk a little bit about my mayor's experience at the Sheriff Andrews House. Back in 2009, when my family moved to St. Andrews, and before I was involved in doing the things that I do these days, I had a little bit of time on my hands, and I gravitated to the Sheriff Andrews House because I'm completely mesmerized by this style of architectural building and because of the artifacts that are inside of this building. And if you haven't seen them, you need to go and see them and tell everybody else to go and see them. But the other thing I found is that just about 2:30 some afternoons, I found myself gravitating to the dining room here because you could smell the cakes and cookies that were being baked in the ovens there, and I knew if I showed up at 2:30, I'd get tea and cookies. So therefore, that was just a coincidence, of course, that I showed up at that time. But I have some very fond memories of sitting down with visitors from other places in the dining room talking about the town of St. Andrews. So it's been a wonderful thing. So look, that's enough from the mayor. Right now, I want to introduce three of the most important personages who frequented this house over the 200 years. Sheriff Andrews, Sheriff Jones, and Miss Hibbard. We're going to come and entertain you with the past.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good morning, folks. Welcome to my house. I'm Alicia Shelton Andrews for this morning. I'd like to tell you how pleased I am that you've come to enjoy my home. And perhaps the best way to tell you a little bit about my home, is to tell you the story of how the Andrews family came to St. Andrews. My family was very comfortably established in Wallingford, Connecticut. And little did my parents know that fate and destiny would bring us north to this land. My father was the youngest of 8 brothers. He attended Yale University, graduating in the class of 1759. And he returned to England and was ordained as an Episcopal priest. So I am the second son of Samuel and Hannah Andrews, and I was born in 1772. After a very bitter period of war in the Connecticut area and south, Father was suspected of harboring loyalties to the homeland. He was the rector at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Wallingford, Connecticut. And the history books will tell you the following, that he was arrested the very day after he had attended a dinner for General Washington, at which he had pronounced a benediction. He was required to remain within his parish, and Anglicans from Meriden were not permitted to come to St. Paul's for services. My father would call on his parishioners only with the consent of the local Vigilance Committee, of which his brother Leben was a member. Days of trouble were at hand, and days of unhappiness for the devoted Parson Andrews. Our rector, to be sure, deserved the suspicions of the townspeople. He offended public sentiment by his declared sympathy for the mother country, of which he made no secret. And when Congress III formed in Philadelphia, and they set aside July 4th as the day of fasting and humiliation, my father preached a text from Amos, chapter 5, verse 21. I despise your feast days, and I will not smell in your assemblies. Now I'll leave it to today's historians to debate the question of whether my father, Parson Andrews, came to St. Andrews or he was sent here. Nonetheless, the fine young clergyman Samuel Andrews joined a number of loyalists in the year 1786, having come from Connecticut, and he came with 2 other clergymen from the Church of England, a Reverend Clark and a Reverend Scombe. Now, for those of you who still live in St. Andrews, you'll know Father purchased an island, still known as Minister's Island. He purchased it from the original grantee named Osborne, and he returned to Connecticut to get the family. He also brought his belongings, and to commemorate his leaving, his parishioners presented him with a beautiful carved coat of arms from the town of Wallingford, which was his former parish. They'd saved it from rebel hands, so eager to destroy anything of British origin, and they presented it as a parting gift to their good rector. And it remains to this day over the east door of your current All Saints Anglican Church. So for Father, they built a lovely, quaint church just around the corner from my house. It was a quaint little building, 55 feet by 40 feet. It had a squat bell tower and high pews. It stood by the alleyway known as Church Lane, and for those who'll take a little stroll today, you'll see we've commemorated it with a sign, Church Lane. The present All Saints Church next door was not built until 1867. So in this little church, 55 by 40, Father held services on Sundays, riding over from the island, his good wife, my mother, Hannah, behind him on a pillion, across the bar and around the shore. And I'm trying to be illustrative here, around the shore, for there was no bar road in those days. Every Sunday for 32 years. No wonder Father's tombstone reads, "A well-spent life and a faithful ministry." The church, which is no longer there, I noticed this morning, was among the first erected in the province. It was afterwards enlarged and was in many respects far superior to most churches of its time. replaced by the present church in 1867, the former church timbers and materials told the story of the history of coming to St. Andrews. The work of Father Andrews was very trying. He was rector of St. Andrews and the only missionary for many years for the whole county of Charlotte. He performed all his arduous duties with zeal and ability, and the records show extended visits to the island, far up in the country, to what's now the flourishing parishes of St. Stephen and St. George. Bear in mind the difficulty of traveling those days before roads were made. The death of my father occurred on the 26th day of September, 1888, at the advanced age of 82 years, 30 of which had been spent in the arduous ministry of mission in New Brunswick. The notice in the St. John Gazette, October 1818, said the following: "This pious and amiable character has retired from the world, full of years and of an admiration and esteem of all who knew him, and while memory holds its seat, the recollection of his virtues and of his worth will be consecrated in the hearts of all his parishioners." I should also mention, as a side note, that in later years when Father was either sick or too exhausted to preach, I was often pressed into service. So I have a particularly soft spot in my heart for Church Lane and that early edifice. Now, unfortunately, Father passed away before this lovely home was built. The home was built in 1820. That's why we're commemorating 200 years this year for the mathematicians. And it was built at the height of the town's economic development by myself, Sheriff Elisha Shelton Andrews, who then was considered a distinguished citizen and son of a loyalist. I had been a lawyer in St. Stephen and then a magistrate of the county, and in 1803 I became the High Sheriff of Charlotte County. Just so folks will understand those responsibilities after having been a lawyer and a magistrate, the High Sheriff's main functions were to uphold the law, supervise elections, and to sell properties. These were very prosperous times in St. Andrews. There was a boom in shipbuilding with the attendant work in the lumber industry and the export of lumber and fish. So in 1820, I decided to leave the island, partly because of the increased commercial activity in town, but more so because I wanted to be close to my work. Where did I build my home? I built my home at the intersection of the King's Road and the Queen's Road. This was a parcel of land originally granted to James Paul, and it was originally granted to be part of the jail block. And just to picture you now, just through here where the town office is today, we had our original jail and our original court, and there was an alley that went right through here, which I'll speak about in a moment. It was called the Jail Alley or the Jail Brook. So you choosing the King Street and the Queen Street, 2 buildings away from the office of the county registry and very few steps away from the Market Wharf and the Market Square. Now, I want you to cast your eyes at the back of my house. And like many things, the back is not as pretty as the front, so I'm going to describe the front and the back. It's an excellent example of what we call Neoclassical Style of architecture, which evolved in the 18th century in England. The style is a rectangular house with a low-pitched gable roof, usually a low-pitched gable roof that would have 4 end chimneys, 2.5 stories, and on the front you'll see a semi-elliptical transom and side lights that set off the door. Now today, because it's no longer 1820, I notice as the sheriff that the conservative nature of the various owners after me, I notice the house has been altered only slightly. It has special importance because the present house best reflects the period of construction. It has simple but good form. It also tells the story, which you will see when you go inside, of what we call upstairs and downstairs, a world of separate quarters for servants in the attic, connected to the basement kitchen. The back stairs allow easy access to the living room, the dining room, the first floor, the nursery, and the bedrooms on the second. However, I will leave it as a bit of a mystery today whether my family could afford domestic help. But it's rather difficult for me to see Mrs. Andrews in the basement cooking. I mentioned Jail Alley. The house is here, but the back portion of the property reflects a lot about the activity of the inhabitants. So the backyard was supported by gardens, various sheds, a carriage house, storage areas, and I'll say this quietly and I'll ask you to look at the grass underneath you, several outhouses. The remains of these should, like the house itself, still be in the ground awaiting the trowel and the dustpan of future archaeologists. The house is of brick construction. Both finished and rough bricks came from Britain in vessels that were returning as in ballast. So when they had no cargo, the bricks would go in the bottom of the vessel. But the rough bricks were only used as filler between the studs. Fine bricks were made here in the town at a brickyard in Joe's Point. Let me tell you a little about my time here in St. Andrews in the 1820s and 30s. And then I'll tell you just a little bit about the war years that preceded. In my time, the gentlemen of the town formed a club. It was called the Friendly Society. It met every week at the homes of different members where they enjoyed pleasant social intercourse, and discussed some special problems that the members might suggest. The subjects were many and varied, and judging from the old minute book. Spirits and water were the only refreshments allowed. Now, they used to meet on Sunday nights, but Dr. Califf did not approve of this. The old doctor had Puritan views about the Sabbath, and Saturday night should be spent in solemn preparation. So the night of the meeting was subsequently changed to Friday night. Now, I told you I was going to mention a little bit about the war years. And of course, I'm speaking of the war 1812, 1813, 1814. These years were very uneasy years in St. Andrews. There it was, right on the border of the most exposed point of the frontier. The men of the town briskly started drilling on the barrack hill, and ships of war patrolled the harbor. A very wise agreement was made between the people living on both sides of the St. Croix River. They held various meetings at both sides of the border, and Eastport and St. Andrews vowed to each other that no matter what happened, they would, if possible, avoid bloodshed or open hostility. And this compact was faithfully adhered to by both sides through the whole period of the war. Nevertheless, St. Andrews prepared for the war. 3 blockhouses were erected, one at Indian Point, one at Joe's Point, and one way halfway between the two, by the red rocks at the head of town. A barracks was also built for St. Andrews, and St. Andrews became a garrison town. But no blood was shed along the banks of the St. Croix River. The chief grievances of the Americans of the day had been against the British Navy. But they staged the war along the shores of the Great Lakes and far out of the reach of the British Navy as possible. Canada had done nothing to bring about the war and was in no way responsible for it, but she was obliged to bear the greater part of the burden. England at that time was entering upon her last struggle with Napoleon and could ill spare troop supplies. New Brunswick sent a regiment to Quebec, the famous 104th of Foot that marched the entire distance on snowshoes in the month of April 1813. My times in St. Andrews were one of general prosperity. The townsfolk had avoided war, we were prospering with our trade, we had established our presence, and we looked to the future with great promise. However, at just 61 years of age, I died on May 26, 1833. With my death, the home remained in family hands for a period of time, and we were very fortunate that a subsequent high sheriff of the county of Charlotte purchased the home, Sheriff